I say it every week. They have the best sermon on Sunday mornings. Thank you, choir, for that. We're in the second Sunday of Advent already. We're in this sermon series, A Weary World Rejoices. And today we're going to talk about joy in community. And I got to tell you, I am so excited to be preaching this Advent series this time of the year. I'm so excited to be leading us through the gospel narrative of Luke, through these different birth narratives of John the Baptist, the greatest prophet of all time, and Jesus, the Son of God. I got to say, I'm most excited because I resonate deeply with these women in these stories. Me and this baby have a negotiation going on that the baby can't come until I'm done preaching this Advent sermon series. So I'm a little too excited about it. We'll see how that works out. Pastor Justin keeps betting that 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve I will go into labor. And I keep rebuking that and saying he's not that prophetic, so I don't think he's right on. Let's hope not. Anyways, thank you for being here for this Advent sermon series. I'm so excited to be going through this. And for those of you who have carried a child before, when we read the scripture of the baby leaping within your womb, I want you to use your creativity and imagination to resonate with that kind of joy. Those of you in the crowd who have not carried a child or do not have a womb, I want you to use your creativity and imagination more so to imagine what it feels like for a child to leap within your womb. The type of excitement, the type of greeting we feel when we embrace someone who we love dearly, we love deeply. This last week we were at my in-laws' house. So we traveled to my husband's parents' house for Thanksgiving. They live near the Grand Junction area, just outside the Grand Mesa. And my father-in-law is a pastor. He's been a pastor for many decades. And he and I are the more sensible ones in the family because we're the early birds of the family. Any early birds out there? We're up before the sun is up. We're the first ones to the coffee pot. But it was so special to spend this time with him. We had all the Christmas trees and Christmas lights all on this morning, and we were gathered together just talking over coffee. We're both very chatty in the morning. The rest of the family are night owls, so they don't get up for a few more hours, and they're a little crankier in the morning when we see them. But it was so nice to spend this time with him, and he gets to share with me his history and experience and ministry for the past few decades, and I get to share some new age stuff. Like I talked to him, I was like, have you ever used AI or ChatGPT? And so him and I were joking about writing sermons with the AI. I have yet to preach a sermon that AI has given me, but I will say AI is some competition, that is for sure. I like to think I'm a little more creative than them still, but we'll see. Anyways, he all of a sudden was talking about Advent. And he was like, I'm really excited to be doing this Advent sermon series. I was like, oh, well, tell me more about it. And he's like, no, I've never done Advent before. And I was like, what? And I've grown up, Presbyterian, Methodist, UCC, familiarity. So Advent's just a part of the church calendar for me. So I was shocked. I was like, what do you mean you've never preached Advent before? And he's like, I've never followed the liturgical calendar. He's like, so I'm going to give it a shot this year. And it was so fun to share this back and forth with him and recognizing that, there are a lot of Christian churches who don't go through the Advent sermon series. So if you're someone who's unfamiliar to Advent, because I think it's silly for me to stand up here and talk about Advent and recognize that, there might be people who aren't familiar with Advent. Advent came about in the 4th, 5th century of the Christian church, and it was the Christian liturgical calendar. It was the start of the Christian calendar, indeed. It's the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas Eve, to the birth of Christ. The word Advent is Latin, comes from adventus, which means coming, which means anticipation, expectation. So Advent is this time that we prepare our hearts, we prepare our minds, we prepare our lives for the Christmas season, for the birth of Christ. So just a little bit of a historical note, because it blew my mind that some people don't know about Advent. So I was like, well, if one person doesn't know it, then there's probably a lot more people who don't know about Advent. So I'm thrilled to be in this Advent sermon series, thrilled to be preaching this text specifically, this text of the visitation of Mary to go see Elizabeth. And in the text, it says that the angel Gabriel, the same angel that went to Zechariah to tell of Elizabeth's conception in her old age for the baby that they had prayed for, goes to Mary and says, your relative Elizabeth. So we recognize that there's already some family ties between Elizabeth and Mary. Theologians have spent way too much time debating on if it's like an aunt-niece, cousin-to-cousin relationship. Regardless, they're related. That's all we can say today. But Mary and Elizabeth are related. They're both in this season of carrying a child that God has promised, that God has given to them. And I want to take notes of a few things, what's unique about this visitation. Elizabeth and Zechariah are regarded in the first chapter of Luke as very priestly, very religious. It even says that they're blameless before God of the 10 Commandments. So they are very religious, high and holy people. And yet Elizabeth, she finds out she's pregnant and she stays secluded for 5 months. And she says she does it because she believes she's a disgrace to the people. So there's an interesting note of why did Elizabeth feel this way? If she was blameless and holy and religious, why did she feel like she had to hide in isolation away from the rest of the world? Was it because maybe she thought people would look down on her for having a baby at such an old age? That her and her husband Zechariah had been diligently praying to God to have this child? And it wasn't until her much later years in life that she was actually able to conceive this child John the Baptist, one of the greatest prophets of all time. So I want to take note of that. Why is Elizabeth feel the need to isolate herself? And then Mary is told by Gabriel that Elizabeth is pregnant. And was not prompted. Gabriel did not tell Mary to go visit Elizabeth, but for some reason Mary felt it within her soul to go visit her family. She felt it within her being that she even went with haste. And we read that so many times, went with a mission. She went on purpose. She went quickly to go visit Elizabeth. Now what's even more interesting with this is Mary is a young girl. She's unwed. And she's now carrying this child, Jesus. She's carrying the Son of God within her. So you have two very different women if we're looking at the spectrum. You have a woman who is religious and who has done everything right, older in age, and she is carrying a child. And then you have what society would look upon Mary as a disgrace because she's unwed. She's this young Jewish girl. Who is she to be getting pregnant and carrying this child? And Mary goes to greet Elizabeth. And I can imagine the thoughts that are happening, right? Put yourself in Mary's shoes. And Mary says, I'm just a young girl and I'm a virgin, I'm unwed and I'm pregnant. And this family relative of mine who's been wanting a baby for so long, who has been praying for this conception for so long, is now pregnant. Maybe there's some guilt, shame going on in Mary's mind of how will this relative respond when she sees me? And we're in this similar season of life, yet very different scenarios. And then how is Elizabeth feeling as well with all of this? She clearly has her own emotions going on that she feels like she needs to isolate and seclude herself for these 5 months. Yet we read the power of rejoicing and joy and community when Mary greets Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's unborn baby leaps within her womb. And she feels this unconditional joy that overwhelms her from the depths of her soul. Just as I asked the kids in the children's time this morning, I want you to think of that person in your life. Who is that person? That maybe their story is very different than yours. Maybe you guys actually walk very different paths in life. You believe differently, you think differently, you vote differently. But when you see them, you can't help but just embrace them and leap for joy and excitement. Who is that person? Call that person to the forefront of your mind right now. What is it about them? Is it because they can unconditionally love you for who you are? No matter what you've done, no matter what you believe, who you vote for or anything, they love you unconditionally? That's what's happening between Mary and Elizabeth. Very different stories. Yet Mary goes to her, knows that she's been in this isolation, and they rejoice together. They could easily, call out their different circumstances, and Elizabeth could have easily been like, well, you're not married, and, you're very young, you shouldn't be carrying this child. And Mary could turn right back around and say, well, you're old, and you shouldn't be carrying a baby. But they rejoice with one another. And they know they are carrying these sacred gifts from God, one the greatest prophet and one the Messiah. Yet there's not even the competition of the different babies that they're carrying within them. There's just equality. What does it mean when we can approach people with joy and see them as equal? No matter what their status is, no matter how elite they may be, no matter what they've done that we're like, oh, that's not very good. How can we greet them with equality and rejoice at just the sight of them, at just the very greeting of them? This time of the year is filled with all of the plans, right? We have all of the events going on. We have the church events, we have the charity events, the family events. We have all of the events overwhelming our calendar. And I'll be the first to admit, as the most introverted extrovert you'll ever meet, I love canceling plans. It's like one of my hobbies. Now you know my secret, I know. But I love to be alone. I love to be at home. Sometimes too much interaction sucks the life out of me, it feels like. But this time of the year, when we get to connect with people that we don't often see all the time, there's so much joy. There's so much that fills us and fuels us because we were made for community. And even though this time of the year is overwhelming and there's so many plans that you just want to cancel, some of them, go ahead, cancel, but others of them, be reminded that God designed us for community. God designed us to find joy in community. Even with that relative that drives you absolutely insane and always has to bring up politics at the dinner table. Yes, that person. Even that person. How can you look at them with equality? How can you look at them as the same beautiful image of God? How can you learn to sit around a table with them and find those sacred connections, those sacred groundings in equality, knowing that God created you for community with one another? God created you to find joy in community. My husband is a therapist, and he specializes in addiction, and he's really, really brilliant. I know I'm biased, but I think he's one of the best therapists. And he always says that the opposite, people often think that the opposite of addiction is sobriety. But he says the opposite of addiction is actually connection. I'm going to say that one more time. The opposite of addiction is actually connection. And I will take it a step further and I'll say the opposite of depression, the opposite of anxiety, the opposite of anger, the opposite of hate is actually connection. Because when we isolate ourselves, when we consume too much negative news, when we consume too much of our own negative thought processes, we tend to spiral. And that hate that we have for that relative that brings up the politics at the dinner table, we spiral in our own minds of, I have to see them tonight. What are they going to say? What is this? And our list goes on and on of why we don't want to see that person. But when we take the time to go to that dinner party, that we know that they'll bring up those politics at that seat, and we know it'll drive us crazy, how can we look at them and say, they have the same hurt that I have in life. They have the same worries, concerns, anxieties, and fears that I have. How can we find that common ground, that equality, knowing that we all have our heartache, we all have our hurt, we all carry our baggage with us? If you're someone in here and you say you don't have baggage, you have lots of baggage, let me say. We all come to the table with our stuff. But when we come together in community, when we gather around a sacred table to enjoy a meal, we recognize that the presence of God is resting upon us, that the presence of God is among us and within us, and that we can rejoice with one another. No matter how different the narratives, how different the stories, the backgrounds we come from are, we can rejoice because we were made for community. Amen.